knowing everything you know now, if you could go back in time and talk to 16-year-old you, what would
Yeah.
you tell him?
I would say the world is scarier than you can ever imagine, but don't be so afraid. When I was a kid, I didn't fit the mold, and I wish I could go back and say, don't be so afraid, you'll make it. The world's full of misfits. I just happen to be a misfit in a certain way. So that doesn't mean the world isn't scary and it's not getting scarier. That's the world we live in. Go for it.
Mr. Robert Jensen, or Doctor, even though you just said to not do that, but that's my default intro, so all right. Well, we've butchered that. Great start to the conversation. Anyways, absolute pleasure to have you on. Do you want to do a quick intro for the people, who you are and what you've been up to for the last, well, however long you want to go back, and then
Hmm.
we can get into the question from the last guest and wherever this
Sure.
conversation takes us.
Well, I had a very sophisticated upbringing in North Dakota. Uh, so I'm a kid from the middle of the country, bumped around journalism for my 20s, ended up teaching, uh, landed a dream job at the University of Texas at Austin, which I rode for 26 years, then retired and escaped from the state of Texas. I'm currently seeking asylum in the state of New Mexico in hiding from the Texas authorities, but retired to a rural area and really am enjoying uh, my escape from the city.
Very nice, very nice. Question from the last guest. He kind of gave me two,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm gonna put them together a little bit, but
Okay.
it's kind of what's your biggest fear with AI, and then also have we lost touch with nature? And I think those are maybe a
Yeah.
bit related, but I'll just leave that there, and you can take it where you
Yeah.
want.
Well, I don't know if I'd call it a fear of AI. There's certainly lots of things to be afraid of, and people with more expertise can speak to that. All I think of when I read about AI is the joy that I had as a young person learning to write, learning to read, the way that opened up worlds for me. And of course, having been born in 1958, there was no assisted intelligence of any kind. So I had to struggle to understand how to read a book. I wasn't never the smartest kid in the class. I had to work hard at it. Uh, I got into journalism in high school and had to learn to write the old-fashioned way with no assistance. And that was a real joy and continues to be a real source of joy for me. I don't use AI to write because I have too much fun writing. And so, less than a fear, it's a concern that younger people won't have the opportunity I had to learn through struggle. And, it's kind of a cliche, but cliches are often true. Most of our growth comes through struggle. And AI, I've played around with it, and it makes some things too easy. Obviously, it has uses that are positive, but I hope young people don't give up on reading and writing in the way my generation had to do it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it makes it there's almost so much information coming at you that that depending on what you're doing,
Yeah.
or if you're a nutcase like me and you need to pay attention to everything that's going on in the world at once. It
Yeah.
can be helpful for kind of summarizing things or churning out sort of like plans for like use it for workout plans for my soccer players that I train and things like
Hmm.
that. And it takes a lot of time and effort away from that and allows me to focus it elsewhere. But yeah, like reading, well, I'll turn this into kind of how you got interested in journalism, but I think at least the way that I have in my life approached reading, I'll say air quotes, the news or
Hmm.
whether it's sports news or other, like I used to get, my parents had a Sports Illustrated subscription. And so always when I was a kid, I was reading it. There was always great articles and there are certain writers that like I didn't realize when I was 13, 14, like I was like, oh, I like how this writer writes. I didn't
Hmm.
realize it then, but looking back, um, that makes sense. And now I don't consume any of that. It's only on,
Hmm.
you get like tidbits from social media here, or it's like a friend texted you, hey, did you see this thing? And then you go Google it or whatever,
Yeah.
or you pop it into AI, like what's the biggest news stories of the last 24 hours? And it gives you an answer. And it almost feels like real sort of investigative journalism where like you actually have to go research a piece and kind of put in the groundwork. You have
Yeah.
sources, this and that. It almost feels like it's gone away to some extent. Is that your kind of, as you've been teaching it
Yeah.
in the industry throughout the years, like what's your kind of summary on journalism at the moment. I know there's a lot in there, but I think for
Yeah,
me, who's not in that industry, is something that I've been super interested in, and I'll give one last caveat before I let you roll on it, is I've had people that have been in kind of news organizations, and I asked them like, do you realize like did you experience the public losing trust in the
mm,
institution, air quotes, of journalism? And they always say, well, no, we didn't really notice that. And I've had a couple people say that, maybe more than a couple. And that always struck me as odd because it's like,
yeah,
are you like, okay, so if you don't know that, then how are you gonna alter, or is my view warped? And then it's like, well, not really, I don't think. And then it's kind of gets into the anyways. So but
yeah,
anyways, what's your kind of your view on journalism when you first got into it and interested in it and like how it's
yeah.
changed? And then we can go into some rabbit holes and stuff, but that's just kind of where I want
Sure.
to start the conversation.
Well, I got into journalism for the same reason a lot of young people did. I was weird and I wasn't good at anything else. And that's actually an accurate account. So I wasn't an athlete. I was short, skinny, effeminate in high school. Um, I was never going to be a popular guy. I wasn't the smartest kid in the class, so I couldn't get by on academics. And so the question is, where do weird kids in high school end up? And it's either the newspaper or yearbook office, or the drama club, or the debate team, or orchestra. And I didn't have any skills in any of those other things. So I landed in journalism. It turned out to be very good for me because I was a really um, messed up kid. And journalism gives you a way to be out in the world as an observer. You don't have to put yourself out in a certain way. And for me, that was really helpful because I was scared of the world. And journalism gave me a way to interact with the world. So, one of the changes in journalism, changes in society more generally, is we can interact through email and texting and all that, which I'm glad I grew up in the era I did because it forced me to go out and talk face to people. And it helped me move from being a really weird, high school kid who was terrified to being able to walk through the world with some confidence, and that was a good thing. So journalism was kind of a lifesaver for me, and I've been involved in it in some fashion my entire life ever since. As far as the news business, journalism as an industry, you've got changes in the business model, changes in technology, and changes in the social environment that have really been important. The business model is, an often told story. When I was growing up, the networks, local TV, and newspapers could survive on advertising. They made a lot of money and they could employ journalists, and everything was hunky dory. Once the advertising started to shift to the internet, the business model collapsed. Uh, Changes in technology pushed that along. And so what had been a stable industry was suddenly unstable. Now, that's good and bad in some ways. So it's good for citizens to have a trustworthy source of information. And we used to think of conventional journalism, CBS News, the New York Times, the local newspaper, as trustworthy. And in many ways they were, but they also betrayed us. So I'm just old enough to have kind of experienced some of the turmoil around the Vietnam War. Well, the U.S. news media did a terrible job of reporting on the Vietnam War up until the very end. They sold America the same line that, John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon were selling. So yes, there was a certain amount of trust people had in the media, but sometimes that trust was misplaced. Okay. Fast forward to today, it's not better because nobody trusts the media, right? A lot of what the media did well, reasons we should trust them, now people don't have that same level of confidence. And so some of the bad ways that we took for granted the conventional wisdom as being accurate, um, some of the ways that's evaporated, I'm glad for. But some of the ways that people now believe they can construct their own reality off of whatever they read online, I mean, I don't need to tell anybody that's been a disaster. It's been a disaster for democracy in the sense there's without shared information and a factual basis from which people can engage in policy debates, it's impossible to have a functioning democracy. And it's bad for life in general when people can't communicate. I mean, everybody's got stories of going to a family gathering that ended up in a shouting match because not because people were having a spirited disagreement, but because they were arguing about the nature of reality, which leads nowhere. So all of this, two step forward, one step to the side, three steps back, maybe we'll go two steps forward again. These are the things you can't really make sense of until the future when you're looking back. But it's a mess. In some ways, that mess is good. In some ways, it's incredibly destructive.
Yeah, that's kind of been my thought as well. Is like I think the mess is somewhat needed. Because I as just a person that's existing would love to have some source of information that I trust,
Yeah,
that I don't have to go digging around to figure out like, okay, well, what's the spin on that, and
yeah,
why did they omit this part, and why did they add that part but not the other part? Like I would love to
yeah,
have that and just be like, yep, this is where this information came from. It's this source and they're trustworthy.
yeah.
But we don't, and so then it kind of puts the onus on
Right,
each individual to actually do the digging themselves, and people
right,
don't have time to do that. And
right.
like I kind of alluded to, like I'm one of the psychos that does it. But then exactly to your point is like
Yeah,
you'll get into conversations with people and you'll say, "Hey, this happened in this way," and you'll get back like,
right,
no, it didn't because I read this headline, and you're like, and then
right,
you have to go, well, that wasn't actually true because this other thing that happened 4 years ago and
right.
blah blah blah, and then this other thing, and so it's too long to explain. Like people don't have
Yeah,
time or the bandwidth to
yeah,
like to go through that, and so the analogy or the what I say often on the show is like it's going to be the Wild West for media for a while, I think, until somebody gets their act together. Whether it's kind of like these independent guys that seem to be starting
hmm,
news companies like the Tim Pools or the Patrick McDavids of the world, like regardless of how you feel about them, they're employing journalists, they've got shows, they've got news like stories on the
yeah.
websites. Um, and so we're seeing this kind of shifting in real time of, yeah, it
Yeah.
is a complete disaster, but maybe a needed disaster. I don't know.
Well, we don't know how it's all going to shake out, but your comment reminds me, I was involved in the anti-war movement for many years, and I
Hmm.
did a lot of public speaking, and people knew I was a journalism professor. So the question I always knew I would get after a talk was, can you give me one source of information I can trust? And I always said the same thing, reflecting what you just mentioned. It would be great if there was such a source. If you really want to be informed in the United States, I would say you have to read the conventional media. I spend an hour or two with the New York Times every morning because it's still the most extensive and trustworthy account of the world that I can find. I also try to read alternative media. In my case, I lean to the left, so there are certain sources I've developed a trust in. I also try to read some of the foreign press, and there's a fair amount of available in English. The Guardian in the UK. There are good English language papers in India you can access online that have an interesting take, right? So from those three sources, you can kind of stitch together a picture of the world. But as you just pointed out, now we're talking about a 3 hour investment of time every day, which most people don't have. One other thing I think it's important to mention, people don't just get information from the media, they get it from social networks. And one of the things I've looked at is the union movement. There used to be hundreds of union newspapers in the United States. There were union meetings where you would go not just to discuss union business, but you would talk about politics. There were, associations of people that helped them understand the world. And a lot of those are gone, especially in a world where people are online so much. And that may seem like not a big difference. What's the difference if you're talking to someone online or in person? But I think if we reflect a bit, we all know that when you develop a relationship face to face with a person or people, you learn who you can trust and who you can't. And that is not easy to do online. So I think the loss of a lot of face to face associations, whether they were political associations, work associations, or even just recreational associations, where people got together to have fun, the absence of those has also diminished our capacity for political engagement. It's another part of the problem. And it goes back to your first question about losing touch with nature. Uh, that's been observed and is obvious. If you look at the amount of time I spent outdoors playing as a kid and the amount of time kids today do, you know, it's just dramatically different. but it's the loss not only of a connection to nature, but a connection to other people. And people have been writing about this and pontificating about it for a long time. I don't have answers to what the effect is going to be. I don't necessarily want to say, well, in the good old days, everything was great, because it wasn't. But we can look at what we've lost, also look at what we've gained, uh, and and realize there's no one magic bullet for any of this.
Hmm. I wanna, well, one quick thought that's maybe tangentially related, but to your point about what people are calling media, even
Mhm.
in like like the sports world,
Yeah.
um, the NBA sort of podcast circle that's sprung up, they call
Uh-huh.
themselves new media.
Yeah.
Um, and like ESPN and some of the others have just turned into debate shows that people don't actually care about because if they just want to watch highlights, and so that's been a weird shift as well. I don't know if you were in the sports journalism world all that much,
Yeah.
aside from that one soccer story that you shared before we were on. But I find that interesting too because
Yeah.
if you ask any sports fan, they're like, I don't like this,
Yeah.
and but yet the networks are still doing it, and so that to me is weird.
Right.
Um,
And some of the old definitions of media have changed, as you're pointing out. So political debate, transmits into other spaces now, and that's sometimes good, sometimes bad. You know, uh, as I said, I've been on the political left most of my adult life, and especially when I first got started, there was a real distrust of what were called mainstream media, conventional media, the corporate media. And as I said, some of that mistrust was warranted. But I always hold on to a basic definition of journalism that doesn't rest on objectivity. Old definitions of journalism said we're objective. You can trust us because we don't have a dog in this fight. We see things as they are. Well, we've learned how that's a kind of a slippery uh, claim to make. But we do want journalists who are independent, who aren't working to advance a political project. And I think independence is more important than notions of objectivity. Yes, we want people to assess facts and have, in some sense, an ability to make objective decisions about facts. But we know that if people are pursuing a political agenda, and a lot of what gets called media, YouTubers and things like that, they don't even have the pretense of that independence. So I think there's still a way to make a difference between media more generally, which may occasionally include information and analysis that's useful, and real journalism that's pursued by people who have a commitment to independence and doing the best job they can to achieve a kind of objectivity. You can make fun of that, but I still think it's where the best work is being done. I've been lucky to know a lot of great journalists, and there's not a single one who thinks, in my experience, that their job is to do politics on the sly. They are really committed to trying to understand the world as deeply and clearly as they can and convey that. They may have a political framework that affects how they present it, you know, but that doesn't mean they're just making stuff up.
yeah.
And it's hard to look at new media and not just say sometimes, "Oh, come on, you're making that up." Uh, the wild speculation, the theories that don't seem to be based on any factual basis at all. I mean, there's a real difference between it. And so people can make fun of the New York Times all they want, make fun of the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN. I'm not saying that those are foolproof sources of information you can trust without challenge. I'm saying that if you're not reading and listening to those kind of sources, you're getting an incomplete picture.
Mm. Yeah, I think yeah, and also to your point about some of the YouTubers and things, there's plenty of people where, or there's plenty of times where
Mhm.
I've seen a clip of somebody that
Yeah,
I've listened to extensively,
yeah,
and the clip paints them in not great a light. And
right.
then of the caption is like, "Oh, can you believe this person thinks this or said this?" And I'll know because I've listened to them more
Hmm.
extensively. Like, that's not actually what they believe, nor what they were saying if you listen
Yeah,
to like 2 minutes before or
yeah,
after. And then people are guilty of doing that from the big or like the legacy outlets.
yeah.
as well. I want to go back to you mentioned Vietnam and kind of that the media didn't do. So, for the purposes of this conversation, when we say, I think when we say legacy media, for those listening,
Yeah.
we're focused on like the traditional kind of newspapers, networks type
Mhm.
deal, and new media pertains more to the YouTubers or independents on Substack, things like that. Just for those listening. Um, but you mentioned the legacy media didn't do a great job of
Mhm.
reporting on the Vietnam War. Just from reading and off the top of my own memory, the Gulf of Tonkin incident and things surrounding the beginning of the U.S.
Mhm.
involvement in Vietnam. Do you remember the coverage of that? Like now, I think, well,
Yeah,
speaking for me, it is obvious that that was kind of a false flag attack.
sure.
But at the time, like, were there people that were saying that, or like, what was the situation going on
Yeah.
there?
Well, I was in grade school at the time, so everything I know about this is
Hmm.
from study. But I would say if you want to understand the Vietnam War, you don't start with the Gulf of Tonkin. You start with Dwight Eisenhower
Yeah.
in 1954 when Vietnam was partitioned after the French were finally chased out. And that leads to the question, well, why were the French back in Vietnam after World War II? We were supposed to be decolonizing. Well, they were back there in part with U.S. support. Okay, there was a split. I won't go through the whole history, but there were elections that were supposed to happen to unify Vietnam in 1956, and they were undermined by the United States. And if you go to Dwight Eisenhower's memoirs, he'll explain why. He said, we had to undermine the elections because otherwise the communists would have won. So democracy couldn't go forward because the wrong people would have won. So the United States was actively involved in undermining the possibility of a free and democratic Vietnam from the beginning. Right? It included John F. Kennedy's use of covert war in certain ways. It was, of course, escalated by Lyndon Johnson and the Gulf of Tonkin, which was largely, as you point out, a fabricated pseudo attack on U.S. forces that Johnson used to increase the war. And then it went to really delusional proportions under Richard Nixon. Uh, Saturation bombing of North Vietnam, the bombing of Cambodia. I mean, things that are so blatantly war crimes by any standard that it's really striking. Well, where was the U.S. news media in all of this? The U.S. news media didn't start to run critical coverage where it was really examining the underlying, justification for the war and the brutality of U.S. attacks. It didn't start writing critically about that till the late 60s, really. So you could argue the U.S. news media for 10 years basically regurgitated the U.S. government's line and helped Americans misunderstand the Vietnam War. Now, in retrospect, people like to say, the media was so critical, they lost the war. Unfortunately, that's not consistent with the actual history. And
Hmm.
that's not unusual for the US news media to fail to offer a critique of government claims. As I said, I was involved in the anti-war movement, and a lot of what I tried to do after 9/11 was, especially during the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, was just point out a lot of what the US news media is, or the US government is saying, is in fact not an accurate account. And there are sources you can find that will explain why. And the US news media in that example also did a very bad job. The run up to the war in Iraq, the US invasion in 2003, was probably the greatest failure of the US news media in my lifetime. All right.
Yeah.
So it does that mean we throw out the US legacy media because they made crucial mistakes, critical mistakes? No, it means you don't replace something flawed with something even more flawed. That is the kind of chaotic world of new media and hyper partisan rhetoric. Uh, that's not getting us anywhere either. So, um, I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know where this is going, nor do I even know how to make sense of it today. But it's not a situation that we want to continue. The inability of people to have shared facts, to argue from a kind of consistent picture of reality, uh, the absence of that is incredibly destructive to democracy. And I don't think Donald Trump could survive if it weren't for that fractured landscape where supporters can continue to believe things contrary to fact simply because they want to. And the current situation.
Let's um let's go back to Iraq before we kind
Uh-huh.
of jump to current day political things. So from the Iraq perspective, looking back,
Mm,
hindsight 2020 again. So I was in similar situation that you were in Vietnam
yeah.
for Iraq.
Mhm.
Looking back, I'm like, okay, obviously this was a horrible idea, and there was no real justification for it. The weapons of mass destruction was a lie that they knew was a lie. Um, where when you were saying like, hey, we don't have justification for this, or like when you
Mm,
are speaking about it, what is the reception that you're getting when you're kind of speaking out about it? Because I can imagine, as we've seen kind of in current day, the people that are running against
mhm,
whatever the narrative is at the time, like when it matters, when that thing is actually happening, oftentimes you take a lot of arrows for
mhm.
that. Um, what was your experience with that?
Yeah, um, I was known in Austin, Texas, where I was living, as a kind of lefty critic, and I had various kinds of tension with people at the university over that. But after 9/11, it really escalated. So I wrote critical pieces about U.S. war plans, really from the first day after 9/11. Some of them actually made it into Texas papers, which produced a huge outcry to fire me. Eventually, the university president weighed in and in public denounced me by name and told everybody not to worry. I was just a lunatic and not to pay attention to me. I mean, it really got kind of weird. I got a lot of death threats. My email and voicemail were full for about a month with people telling me what they wanted to do to me.
Oof.
Uh, so I went through that. But I look back. Uh, I never really felt physically threatened. Turned out I did manage to keep my job. But a lot of the reason that doesn't feel so threatening was I was part of a movement. There was an anti-war movement, a more general movement for global justice. Uh, and I was part of that, and I had deep associations and friendships with people in it. And so the fact that the general public was, calling for my head on a stick out in front of the university is like, okay, that happens. And I always thought that when you engage in public debate very, you know, publicly by writing in newspapers and going on television, and you're saying things that are contrary to the conventional wisdom, you're going to get some pushback, and it's just part of the game. Now, of course, when that elevates to people being fired for no reason, or people being deported for no reason, or people being physically and actually not just threatened, but physically attacked, then you're at a whole different level. But I look back at the post 9/11 atmosphere, which was very tense, and compared to things today, it was pretty low key. It's far more dangerous today to speak out than immediately after 9/11. And of course, I always have to point out, I'm a white guy. I had a PhD. I worked at a big university. Uh, the government didn't tend to come after people like me. They go after people who aren't so, safe, people who aren't necessarily U.S. citizens. They go after women and people of color differently. So I had a lot of protection in a lot of ways. Uh, but that said, it was a wild time right after 9/11 for, about 2 years.
Were you ready for it when you wrote like the first piece that went into the newspaper? Were you sitting there like, all right, it's going to get published, waiting for the voicemails
Yeah,
and the letters to start coming, or was it kind of like how much were you ready for it versus like
yeah,
it being a surprise?
yeah. Well, one of the things I got going for me is that I'm not very bright, so I don't ever really think about the potential consequences. I'm not smart enough to say, wait, if I do this, it might be. I didn't really even think about it. But again, that was partly because my friends, my comrades, we were all doing that work. And so it didn't seem like I was alone. It didn't seem like I was vulnerable. And that's I think a big lesson for me is that politics is not a solo venture. Politics works when people have communities within which they operate. It helps us understand the world better. We engage in collective action, and then when you run into people who disagree with you, you have a base from which you can have meaningful interaction. People who just spout off their opinions and then go home. aren't of much interest to me. People who are really engaged in trying to understand the world with a good faith attempt to be accurate and care about the consequences. Um, and so a lot of the people on the other side, people who were very angry with me, I had a lot of respect for them. They were doing what they thought was politically necessary. They believed the U.S. was under threat. They believed things like the invasion of Iraq were important. They were wrong. I tried to argue they were wrong. Turns out my side was correct in our assessment. But that leads to another observation about the U.S. that's kind of strange. If you think about Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and George W. Bush and Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell, all of the people who pursued that invasion of Iraq, well, they turned out to be wrong. They turned out to be either corrupt or stupid or both, and they really didn't suffer any consequences. They went about being elder statesmen. George W. Bush is living happily somewhere in Texas. You know, there was never a kind of a cost to them. Meanwhile, the people I knew who were doing some of the best anti-war analysis, they're still considered marginal. I have friends who are some of the sharpest global analysts I know who were 100% right about Afghanistan and Iraq, and they're still considered fringe. Why? Because they're not part of the club. They're not part of the conventional wisdom. So, I still have some hope that uh, information can change people's understanding of the world. But I have to say, it's an uphill struggle, not just because of the fragmented new media YouTube problem, but because there still is a conventional wisdom that's very powerful and keeps people from sometimes opening up to real critique. And I think that's right now, most of the work I do in this area is around the ecological crises and the environmental problems, where I think there's also a lot of inertia about really coming to terms with the nature of the crisis.
Yeah. I want to dig into the anti-war stuff a little bit because
Sure.
I think there's a growing um, anti-war sort of coalition from the right, or
Hmm.
maybe a more libertarian kind of view as well. Um, and so, like for example, those types would agree with everything that you said about the Bush administration, and
Yeah.
then they would add in about the Obama administration regarding Libya and Syria and Yemen and some of the other
Hmm.
things that went on there. And they would then have the same critiques about, well, including Ukraine the first time in 2014. And then they have the same critiques about Trump one, same critiques about Biden and the policies there, same critiques Trump two about Iran and now Venezuela. Um, from your perspective, where like this seems to be relatively new to me. Is that also your take? Like, was the anti-war movement mostly coming from the left, or was there always a contingent from the more libertarian side as well?
Yeah.
And then the follow-up to that, I guess, would be, is there a way that those two movements can generally work
Yeah.
together? Because I feel like there's a lot of common ground there, and and I think, and maybe I'm extrapolating a little bit, but kind of the foreign policy critiques, I think, also are connected to a lot of the other problems in terms of monetary supply, sound money, domestic policy, as well, are kind of offshoots of failed
Yeah.
foreign policy.
Yeah.
And so because I see that on wherever I'm reading, it's like, okay,
Sure.
yeah, we've got the right-leaning libertarian types saying, yes, Bush administration bad for going into Iraq. And then I hear somebody like you saying the same thing, and I'm like, good, everyone agrees, but it doesn't seem like there's
No.
any talking there.
Well, everyone agrees at a certain level, but there's profound disagreement at other levels. But
Sure.
before I go into that, I want to point out something you said that's really important. The critique that I've been part of, the anti-war movement that I've long associated with, isn't partisan. It doesn't critique Republicans but go easy on Democrats.
Hmm.
When I first started doing public work, it was during the Bill Clinton administration, and we were contesting Bill Clinton's policy in Iraq, his bombing of Yugoslavia, which was
Yep.
another, illegal action. And we ran into lots of opposition from mainstream Democrats, but we thought we were pursuing a principled critique that was important. As I pointed out, the Vietnam War, the debacle of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, took place under two Republican and two Democratic presidents. It was a bipartisan disaster in that sense. So I think that's very important. Noam Chomsky, who's a kind of touchstone for the anti-war movement,
Hmm.
used to say every post-World War II U.S. president was guilty of war crimes, and if we applied international law appropriately, would have been, convicted. So this is a critique about the structure of the world economy and world diplomacy and world military relationships. So yes, on some uh, straightforward questions like should the U.S. invade Iraq, you could find people on the right, as you pointed out, mostly with libertarian politics. Probably Rand Paul today, the senator, is the most prominent example.
Yeah,
Who,
Thomas Massey as well, probably
yeah,
another good example.
who would agree. But the question is, what structure, what understanding of the structure of the world does that come from? So on the left, those of us who were part of the anti-war movement were also part of what we would call a global justice movement, which was to say that the West, which means North America, Europe, Japan, the imperialist policies, the long-standing colonialism, which morphed into a more of a economic imperialism after World War II, uh, that created the incredible disparities in the world, which are at the heart of these military endeavors. It's about control of resources. It's about control of wealth. And so you can't solve the problem by just saying the U.S. should not go off on foreign wars. You have to also ask, how are we going to rectify the dramatic imbalances in the distribution of wealth around the world? Now, I, I'm the first to say I don't think that's a simple question. We're in a deep hole at this point, both because of that inequality in the distribution of wealth and power, as well as the severity of the ecological crises. So I'm not one to come up with glib, platitudes about how we can make this better. In fact, the older I get, the more I think some of the problems we're talking about really don't have solutions if we mean solutions that are going to be, implemented through policy and in some short-term concept. So I I welcome any shared critique with the right, but I also think it's important to recognize that deeper disagreement, which is eventually going to, come to the fore. You can have short-term alliances to achieve a short-term goal, but the deeper and longer-term analysis of why the world is in the trouble it's in, that's eventually going to create a rift, and in political terms. And I think we just have to be aware of that. You know, exploit the the possible connections where we can to make progress where we can, but realize eventually it's going to be that same old fight about who controls the wealth of the world.
Yeah, I mean, that answered the question perfectly because a lot of it for me is like, where does the principle that the
Mhm.
anti-war movement from the left perspective comes from?
Yeah,
Um, no, so that makes total sense, and I do think, yeah, to your point about maybe exploiting some
yeah,
level of unity for that would maybe be a good place to start, and then we can actually have a policy discussion on what to
yeah,
do
yeah,
afterwards after we stop wasting
yeah,
money in all these places.
yeah.
Um,
But
and
if I can say one more thing,
yeah, yeah.
the world changes and it changes pretty dramatically and
Hmm.
often very quickly. So after World War II, there was something called the non-aligned movement. These were the countries that weren't part of the Soviet bloc, and they didn't want to be subordinated to U.S. power. India was one of them, and it was a source of great hope in the 50s into the 60s that this non-aligned movement could be a source of ideas and political activity to create a third world, the global south, whatever term you want to use, that could chart its own course. Well, India was a leader in that. Where is India today? It's run by a pseudo-fascist government, Hindu nationalism, the same kind of ugly attacks on religious minorities that you see all over the world. I mean, the last place today I would look for insight is the politics of India. India is a scary place. I happen to know some prominent Indian journalists, and I literally fear for their lives. There have been three or four prominent journalists and intellectuals murdered in India in the last decade by the kind of right-wing Hindu fascist forces. Well, that's a big shift. We can't pretend anymore that the global South, the third world, is going to be the source of, great independence and liberation. Venezuela is another good example. The so-called Bolivarian revolution that Chavez initiated, it did distribute the wealth of the country more equitably. It also produced a very rigid and authoritarian government. Nicolas Maduro, lacking Chavez's political skills, presided over, the disintegration of a country. Does that mean that the U.S. intervention, the illegal invasion, the kidnapping of Maduro is justifiable? No. But it means we can't, make glib statements from the left that, if only the Bolivarian revolution could be allowed to go forward, life would be great for Venezuela. It's just not that simple anymore. The world is maddeningly complex. It's getting more maddening as time goes by. This may be the rantings of an old guy. I don't know, but that's the way it looks to me. The older I get, the more experience I have, the less I find platitudes very reassuring.
Mm. What do you mean when you say fascism or fascist?
Yeah,
What do you mean by that? Because a lot of people
yeah,
just throw that term around.
yeah,
So I'm not saying that you are just doing that. I'm
yeah.
just asking for clarification.
Yeah, I actually almost never use the term for precisely the reason you say. It becomes a political insult. I used it only in the context of India because India does have a fascist movement. The governing party of Prime Minister Modi right now is called the BJP, but it has a non-political wing called the RSS that really is a fascist movement. Its roots are in traditional European ideas of fascism. It's Hindu nationalists. They want to drive the Muslims out of the country. It's violent and always has been violent. So I agree completely that tossing around, overheated rhetoric does nobody any good. I, for instance, am, as you can imagine, not a great supporter of Donald Trump, the MAGA movement, or the Republican Party. But in either public presentations or writing, I have never called them fascist. I don't think that does anything. Fascism was a particular movement at a particular time in European history. And and yes, you can see the echoes of it in the MAGA movement, but I don't see the point of running around saying fascism has come to the US. Authoritarian movements are a threat. The way that Trump has, basically thumbed his nose at established concepts in the law is a threat. All of that's a threat, but you don't have to call it fascist to make that point.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, you could say like the Azov battalion in Ukraine was like actually kind of fits that description um of the neo-Nazi types. And that
Yeah,
if
and
for
and
people want to go Google that, I didn't just make that up. That exists.
no, and so Ukraine is another example of complexity. There are different political factions within Ukraine, right? The pro-Russian and the anti-Russian. Within the anti-Russian faction, there are some pretty nasty folks. But at the moment, the question is, can the Russian invasion and attempt to conquer eastern Ukraine, uh, should it be accepted? The U.S. performance after the end of the Cold War, its goading of Russia, all sorts, you can point to all sorts of mistakes that U.S. policymakers made that helped create this situation. And you can also say that if you're a Ukrainian and you have a stake in an independent country, all of that complexity kind of melts before the need to repel a Russian invasion. The Russian invasion is about as justified as the U.S. invasion of Venezuela the other day. They're both patently illegal under international law. They both have no moral justification. And they're both the product of a certain political leadership that has decided power is more important than, principle. Power is more important than law. Power is more important than morality. These are not the first political leaders to take that position. World history is full of it. But we're fighting these problems today. You can point to the Roman Empire, you can point to all sorts of places where things were worse, but that doesn't help us resolve problems today.
Yeah, I think to your point about the U.S. goading of Russia, I think that's Yeah, the complexity of that situation. I think that's really well put.
Yeah.
And I think also for those listening, Scott Horton has I don't know if you're familiar with him, but Scott Horton has a book called
Mm.
Provoked that kind of lays it out. It's a bit of a tough read because he's not the
Yeah.
best narrative writer. It's more of just
Yeah.
like this happened and this happened, but it lays it out in a pretty I mean comprehensive, I think is the word I'm looking for. Kind of
Sure.
the history of that. Um, and then one last question on
Uh-huh.
the nationalism question, or on this topic before we move back kind of into the journalism space. The nationalism question to me is one that I kind of bounce back and forth with because on one hand, you don't want to have kind of movements spring up where it's like fanatical nationalism, right? The Europe in the early 1900s, right? You don't want that sort of thing because obviously, as we saw,
Hmm.
that led to the two biggest wars and hit the two biggest disasters in human history. But at the same time, like currently, I think also for like it's not bad to want to have a national identity and a culture that like you
Hmm.
feel a part of. And so I struggle with that in terms of hearing that term be used as solely negative. And I think that misses some of the maybe the I'll say especially for the younger generation that has seen lots of immigration and they
Hmm.
aren't sure what's going on and they're like, what does this country stand for? Like I want a
Yeah.
place where I can be like, yes, I'm American or whatever the country is. And I think that um having the term be solely negative kind of misses a important
Yeah.
nuance in which like well, if people feel like they're a part of something, then they have stake in the future and they
Yeah.
want to build things and build communities. And if they don't feel like they're a part of anything, then they'll just look out for themselves. And that's really not a good way to build
Yeah.
a society either. So I see both sides of that. And I kind of wondered what your take on it was because, and I'm slightly ascribing this to you,
Yeah.
but also just based on your political leanings and how you've described it thus far, it seems like you view it as a negative thing, which I don't
Yeah.
also disagree with, but I think there's another side as well that I
Sure.
wanted to get your thoughts on.
Well, I would give you a sort of philosophical and principled answer and then a practical answer. The philosophical answer and the principled one is I think there are only two levels at which human beings should be trying to make sense of the world. One is the very local level, because, we evolved in very small, gathering and hunting communities. We're wired up to function in small groups, 100 or less probably. That's 95, 99% of our evolutionary history. So it's not surprising we're not very good at making sense of bigger groups because we didn't evolve that way. So I happen to, as I mentioned, live in rural New Mexico, and we have an irrigation association. We have lots of ways that I'm part of the local community that I think are very meaningful because those interactions are face to face. I actually meet the people who are running for county commission. Everybody comes and knocks on your doors, and there's a kind of way that that works, not perfectly. People still argue, people still get upset with each other. Um, uh, it's a long story, but nothing is perfect. The other level that I think about is at the level of the universal principles, universal principles that I can put into practice anywhere, like the basic human right to life. I don't think that's an American concept. I don't think it's a Christian it's a human concept. So I try to live at the local level and the universal level. Everything else in between is going to get us in trouble from my point of view. Right. So a commitment to the idea that I'm an American, that I'm a U.S. citizen. I am a U.S. citizen. I have a passport. I have a birth certificate. I don't want to move anywhere else. I'm perfectly happy living here. But that to me isn't part of my identity. That's the principled and philosophical perspective. The practical one is much more complex, as you pointed out. Most people need a sense of identity that gives some place in the world for them. For some people, it's primarily religious. I know lots of people for whom their core identity is, let's say, Christian. In the world I live in, that's the kind of people I meet. For some people, it's being a citizen of the United States. When I lived in Texas, for a lot of people, it was being Texan. For people who've never been to Texas, there's a particular psychosis in Texas that makes them think they're special over everybody else. I've never seen anything quite like it. Strangest psychological.
There might be in New York, a New York one as
Well,
well.
yeah, but Texans take it to a different
They
level.
do,
Okay,
they do.
right. So we can see where those allegiances go off the rails pretty quickly. And nationalism is one that can go off the rails pretty quickly. But as you point out, it's also a rallying point for collective action. So, we've been talking about conflicts between the United States and countries in the global South or the third world. If you were a Nicaraguan in the 1970s and you were trying to get rid of this brutal dictator that the US had supported for decades, right? A sense of being a Nicaraguan who had a right to national self-determination for Nicaraguans, who shouldn't be under the thumb of somebody who's funded by the United States and backed by the US military. Well, that was a very powerful motivation, right? So nationalism can cut both ways. So can, any idea. Religion can cut both ways. I mean, we all know that religion can motivate people to some of the most selfless and compassionate action you'll see in the world. And it can turn people into raving, jingoistic lunatics who will kill for God. Well, that's the reality. Any idea that you get that you can use to motivate people for something positive can turn ugly pretty quickly. And you could argue that's the history of ideology. Think of early socialists in the 19th century in Europe, right? That was a way to think this brutal capitalist system that is, employing children in factories for 14 hours a day. How do we break the hold of this demonic system? Well, it turned into the Soviet Union and the gulags and terror states. Anything that can motivate people to good can also, it turns out, motivate them to some really barbaric behavior, and we're stuck trying to figure the best of that out.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it as well, because exactly like you said, the motivations of the socialists are it's like, yeah, it's got right. Well, the saying is what the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah,
Um, and yeah, like the Soviet Union, in terms of on the scoreboard of
mm,
most people killed in by a regime, you've got
yeah,
the communists in China and the Soviet Union
yeah,
are probably, I think, one, two.
yeah.
And so that like, yeah,
Let,
it's
let
a
me give you another example of how crazy the world can be.
mhm,
When I mentioned Nicaragua in the 1970s, people might know the Sandinistas was the name of the revolutionary group that challenged the U.S. imposed dictator. Well, the Sandinistas took power. A man named Daniel Ortega was one of the leaders, and he was president for a while. Well, Daniel Ortega is back as president of Nicaragua, and he's one of the biggest thugs in Latin America. He's purged the government of any opposition. He's thrown into jail or driven into exile some of his old comrades, and he and his wife run Nicaragua, kind of like a mafia state. Well, here's a guy who, 40 years ago was at the forefront of trying to liberate Latin America from U.S. dominance, and now he's no better than a gang leader. Uh, yeah, that's the way the world works. It's an ugly fact. But again, glib platitudes about long live the revolution, they don't take you very far. They motivate people in the short term, but they're dangerous, and I think we have to accept that.
yeah. I think that to be honest, I think that's a good spot to bring us back into the world of journalism, which
Uh-huh.
one would argue, especially in the political and geopolitical kind of space that we've been talking, the role of the journalist is to expose people that are
Hmm.
doing these sorts of things and to like
Yeah.
inform people that, hey, this bad thing is happening and we should do something about it.
Yeah.
Um, when you were teaching,
Uh-huh.
how has your teaching, I'll use the term curriculum because I can't think of a better term,
Sure.
but how has the curriculum changed from when you were first teaching to when you retired not too long ago? Like, because everything is different
Yeah.
from like you were it was newspapers, and then all of a
Hmm.
sudden now it's like, okay, can you go viral on
Yeah.
YouTube? And even the legacy
Yeah.
networks are putting stuff on YouTube
Yeah.
and things like that as well.
So I retired in 2018. It's been a long time since I've been in the classroom, but uh, I would answer your question this way. When I started teaching at the University of Texas at Austin in 1992, it goes way back. I thought one of my jobs was to help students who wanted to be good journalists understand that the industry wasn't perfect and that they had to go through a kind of self-critique to understand their own framework of understanding the world. Because it's not just a question of going out in the world and finding facts, bringing them back and putting them in the paper. The way you go about finding facts is influenced to a large degree by your picture of the world. And a lot of journalists had a kind of conventional wisdom picture of the world. As I pointed out, it led to bad reporting in Vietnam, right? And so I thought part of my job was to help students develop that kind of critique, to be critically self-aware and aware of the limitations of the industry they were going to go into. Not so that they should abandon journalism, but they should be aware of how it worked. Well, by the time I quit, as journalism was starting to collapse and the business model had evaporated and it was even hard to find a job, I shifted to trying to help students realize that that struggle to develop that self-critique, but then go forward and really continue the work of providing an independent source of information for people that wasn't immediately politicized, that really was valuable. And so, I have students who struggled with that. One of my favorite former students is recently a high-level editor at the New York Times. And I still keep in touch with her, and she's got that capacity for self-critique. She's accepted the basic outlines of the New York Times. She's not a revolutionary, but she's doing incredibly good work. I had another student, that student was kind of left-leaning to start with. I had another student who was right-leaning, who went to work in the media and became, I think, also self-critical and did incredibly good journalism. So to me, none of this is about, finding lefty students and getting them to infiltrate journalism. It was about asking students, wherever you come from, be self-aware, be aware the industry you're entering has a structure and is going to make demands of you, which is true of any job anybody gets in any profession. If you're going to be a lawyer or, a professor or a city planner, you're not operating in some vacuum. You're operating with an institution that's constraining you while also making some things possible, and you make the best of it. Um, you know, Again, I don't want to be too harsh on some of my lefty comrades, but I often thought that the left-wing critique of mainstream media was a little tone deaf to the complexity of the world. So they would say things like journalists lie. Well, the fact is most journalists don't lie. They may present information they gather in a way that's not, from my point of view, sufficiently, complex or too easily accepts what people in power say. But they don't lie. Journalists don't get up in the morning. Nobody at the New York Times, I can guarantee you, gets up in the morning and says, how can I lie to the American public today to con them into something they don't want? That's just not, if you've ever been in a newsroom, journalists are incredibly committed. I mean, it doesn't pay that well. The hours are crappy. When I was in my 20s and working in a newsroom, I got up every day and thought I had the best job in the world because I got to go out, talk to people, chase down stories, show up at the scene of a murder, talk to the city manager, do things that ordinary people didn't get to do. And I was firmly committed to telling the truth as I saw it. Now, I made mistakes. The institution I worked for made mistakes, but it wasn't intentional distortion. It's just the way complex systems play out.
I think I agree with that generally. I would say, though, during COVID, the legacy outlets got caught in some, if not purposeful distortion, highly negligent distortion
Yeah.
around some like a couple of examples. There was a story that I believe it was CNN ran that said that there were gunshot victims waiting outside an Oklahoma hospital because too many people had OD'd on ivermectin, and they
Hmm.
used a stock photo from like people in winter jackets, and it came out
Yeah.
in August, and it's like either that's incredibly sloppy or it's purposeful distortion. And then
Yeah.
the other one that comes to mind is when um, Rogan got COVID and he put out a video saying like he took all these medicines and that he was feeling better. CNN aired the clip, but they filtered his face yellow to make him look more sick.
Hmm.
And so those are some, I'm not saying that that
Hmm.
happens all the time, but I'm saying And I don't think that it's the ground level journalists
Yeah,
that are doing it either. I think it's probably more
yeah,
network executive types that make the decision. But from somebody who's just consuming and who doesn't make that distinction, there's a, to our conversation earlier
mm,
about the whole thing has become a big mess.
yeah,
It's easy to point to examples like that and be like, well, they lie. And I think to your point as well,
yeah,
it's much more nuanced than that, like we've been
yeah.
talking about. But there's been some instances where that happens and people are
Mm.
getting a very sour taste in their mouth, especially the last 5 years, I think.
Absolutely. But COVID, I think, is a good example. So remember that COVID threatened, as a worldwide pandemic, COVID could have been dramatically worse than it was, right? Millions of people died, but it could have been far worse.
Hmm.
And people in public health were trying to figure out how can we help the public, right, protect itself. And there was a lot of misinformation all over the place. And not just things about which there was a debate, but just crazy stuff. Right? And public health officials were trying to figure out how do we contain this? And journalists, especially journalists who cared about getting the truth out, were part of that process. And sometimes mistakes were made. So take the one that's most obvious. Where did COVID start? Was it from a wet market in China or was it a lab leak? Well, people immediately in power said, no, no, no lab leak, no lab. They tried to shut that story down. Well, it turned out nobody really knew, and to date, nobody really knows. The majority of people who've studied this tend to think it came from animal transition in a market in China, but it's not an ironclad case. But remember, at the time, people were afraid that if it was a lab leak, even more conspiracy theories would float, and people would start to think it wasn't even a real, disease, or they would. And so people were worried about what are the consequences to the death rate. And this isn't abstract. This isn't about arguing over ideology. This is
Hmm.
people in public health concerned about how many people were going to die. And a lot of bad calls were made. I agree. Right? But that's true of every public health crisis there's ever been. Remember when AIDS first started, uh, they promoted what they thought was a good protection against AIDS called AZT, which ended up killing people. And
Yeah.
it turned out to be a wrong move. But on the fly, people were trying to figure out how can we save human life. And mistakes got made, and journalists were sometimes part of that. But in retrospect, I look at the journalistic performance around COVID and think, given all of the constraints based on constraints about what we knew at the time and a well-founded desire to protect public health, journalists didn't do so bad. Uh, but the mistakes are, as you point out, easy to point to. That's true of almost everything, though. You can, take a football coach who, provides great coaching, 99% of the time, and then calls a bad play, and fans scream for their, head on a pike. It's a human instinct. It's understandable. Uh, Part of my
Yeah.
job as a professor was try to take the long view.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely hear what you're saying. Um, I think I have a slightly more negative view on the
Hmm.
performance during COVID. And I think, and also one of the things that was super interesting to me was that after CNN filtered Rogan's face yellow,
Mhm.
Sanjay Gupta went on Rogan's show, and that conversation did not go well for Sanjay Gupta and CNN generally
Yeah,
as a kind of organization. There was another instance, um, Dave Smith, who's kind of he's a libertarian type, debated. He went on. He had a there was like a 3 hour show with him and Chris Cuomo, where Cuomo essentially it was this argument. It was like the media, we did our best and this sort of thing. And Dave Smith pulled out lots of examples of like, okay,
sure.
well, why'd you say this? And then Cuomo would be like, well, I didn't say that. And then they'd be like, roll the clip, and then it was him
Yeah,
saying it. And it's like, oh, okay, that's
yeah.
it's like that's not a good look. So I mean, again, I hear what you're saying, and I don't want to go down
Okay.
this rabbit hole
Yeah.
because different people have different interpretations of the
No,
data at the time and that sort of thing. But I I
I,
would not be for the people that have been listening to the show for quite
mm,
some time. I need to say these things as a matter of
That's
principle, right? I
fine.
have people that are close to me that are immunologists and that think it's very much likely that it was lab and things like that. So
Yeah,
I
sure.
didn't want to go back on my own
No,
self and want to stay consistent. But
no, that's fine. I don't take offense when people disagree with me. But there's a couple of things I want to point out. One
mhm,
is uh, because the news media are so visible and you have tape of everything, it's easy to find mistakes they make, and those mistakes are real. But I think it's also important to remember that a lot of the people who were on the other side, challenging so-called the dominant narrative, they were telling people not to wear masks. They were promoting the transmission of the virus. And those were decisions that had life and death consequences. So there are people, today who are dead who would be alive if there had been a more, um, rigorous use of masks. And there were people in the media who were saying, "Don't worry, don't wear a mask. It's all BS." Well, that's part of the story too. The
mhm,
other thing I want to point out, and it harkens back to something I said earlier, if you've been in a newsroom, you know how chaotic it is. Information is coming in real time. It's easy to step back later and say, well, you shouldn't have believed this claim and you should have believed that claim. But newsrooms are a chaotic space because that's the nature of the business. And a lot of decisions are made on the fly that turn out to be wrong decisions. Right? And the question is, can an institution learn from that? Now, one thing you and I probably would agree on is the media, like any other institution, the legacy news media, can be a little defensive. And as their business model was collapsing, they tended to be more defensive because they felt themselves losing the cultural power they once had, as well as the economic stability. And so I think one of the things we would agree on is a lot of the prominent mainstream journalists are far too unwilling to think about criticism of the media that's well founded. I agree completely. But I'll tell you, as someone who worked in a university for 30 years, universities are not very good at taking critique either. I worked in government offices and I found government officials didn't like critique. In other words, any institution that has some power and standing and wants to hold on to it tends to, at least at first, reject that kind of criticism. That's not an apology for the news media. It's a reckoning that the news media are not the only folks who do that. Um, and you can see it in every political movement there ever was, including the dominant political movement in the US today, uh, the MAGA movement, which, doesn't accept critique at all and turns every failure into more evidence of its supposed superiority. Uh, it's going to be um, interesting to see where we land in 10 years uh, and look back on this. But I think, I guess, as I said, when I get older, I think I appreciate complexity more. I also think, and this will sound like kind of a squishy comment, but I've become a more compassionate person. And I mean that seriously. I live in a rural area now, and some of my neighbors are Trump supporters and MAGA people. And I have a lot of compassion for anybody who's suffering, struggling, trying to make sense of the world. I try to ask, why do they see the world the way they do? I don't go into conversations, as I probably was more likely to when I was younger, and say, listen, I understand how you see the world. It's wrong. Let me help you understand the correct way. The reason I don't do that so much anymore is number one, it's highly ineffective. The worst way to persuade somebody you're right is to tell them they're stupid. Uh, the second is I think that compassion comes from also seeing my own limitations, my own flaws, my own mistakes. I think as we age, we should get a little more tender with each other. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes as people get old, they get crankier and uglier because they're angry. And I've seen that too. Uh, human psychology is all over the map. And I think if there's a sort of theme in what I've been trying to say, it's that we have to cultivate the capacity for self-criticism. Before we point out everybody else's mistakes, it's good to be able to see your own. And I've made a lot of them in my life. And I've made a lot of them politically. And the other is to quote the song, try a little tenderness. Um, that can be hard when somebody's, if I'm originally from Mexico and I'm facing somebody who's shouting at me saying, "Go back to Mexico, you stinking wetback." It's hard to be compassionate, right? But that's the struggle to try and see the humanity in everyone, and it cuts both ways. Everybody
Mhm.
needs to try and do it.
Yeah, I think it's great to figure out where people are coming from, um, because I mean that's the first, right? This
Yeah,
goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning of the
yeah,
conversation, which is oftentimes people on opposite sides of these things are
yeah,
living in two different realities. And
yeah,
it's like, well, if we can find somewhere to start, then we can at least have a productive conversation
yeah.
on something. Um, I
Let
want to
me give
go.
you one more
Yeah,
example, if
yeah,
I
go
can, real
ahead.
quickly. I know a guy here, he's older than I am, and he fought in the Vietnam War. He's politically conservative. Uh, he almost died in the Vietnam War. He got shot up pretty bad and he barely made it out. And every day of his life, he has pain. His body never recovered. He can't move without remembering that. Okay. When I think about his political orientation, I'm very conscious that he carries with him an experience I will never have. I was too young to fight in the Vietnam War. I didn't get drafted. Uh, I've never been in combat. I've never been in the U.S. military. I have a critique of the U.S. military and the way it's used by politicians, and I'm going to stand by that critique. But that's a lot different than looking at somebody who's had that experience of being shipped to a foreign country when he was 18 years old, almost dying, coming home, and living with the consequences of that. If I can't understand that experience of his, then it's hopeless. We'll never get anywhere politically, right?
Yeah.
And that's real.
I think that distinction of your criticism is very important. I had a friend of mine recently share, she was having a discussion with somebody else, and they had made the comment that this person's significant other was a war criminal because they were
Mm,
in the US military. And it's like,
mm,
okay, hold on.
mm.
Let's not do that. We can
Yeah,
we can critique the politicians for how they're using it, but like some guy, like if
yeah,
he's trying to get out of a bad whatever the situation is, I think
sure.
that distinction is very important. And then, what was I going to ask? Oh yeah, I wanted to go back to the curriculum question a little bit, which
Oh,
is
sure.
like, what, and more of what I was getting at is like, what do you actually teach? I wasn't getting into I, kn- the critique that you mentioned about
Yeah,
people that say like, oh, it's all about getting lefty students into
yeah,
journalism. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
those people, whatever. But like,
yeah.
what do you actually like? What like if somebody's a journalism student, what are they actually learning?
Well, there are, of course, the skills of the trade, how to do good reporting, how to write clearly, how to edit, how to put together, video packages. Uh, we would call those the skills courses, and part of the instruction in any journalism school is in that skill. And when that's done well, that's done without political content at all. I had some colleagues, many were former journalists who'd moved into teaching, who were amazingly good at helping 18-year-old kids who couldn't write a clear sentence learn to write a clear sentence. And I value that ability. That is really, God's work. I tended to teach more conceptual courses, and the course I taught most was media law. So I taught students how to understand libel law. And that also didn't really have a political content to it. Uh, that was about learning to understand legal principles, apply them to your work. And I loved it. I still love the law. I'm not a lawyer. I never wanted to be a lawyer, and I will disavow any connection to the legal profession. But the law itself is a fascinating part of the human experience. And so I had more fun than I had a right to, lecturing about libel law, lecturing about concepts about freedom of expression, core concepts. I often look back at my so-called job and the cliche, if you love what you if you love your work, you never work a day in your life. And it's true. And university teaching was like that for me. So we were committed to skills teaching, to fundamentals of media practice. And then I also taught courses about the political and social impact of media that were a little more, could be a little more edgy. And those were, I think, important too, because students going into journalism need to understand the implications of what they're doing. Journalism schools have changed a lot in the time since I first got into the gig. That's largely a function of technology because many of the skills we used to teach simply aren't relevant anymore. And some of the skills people need today, didn't exist when I was a beginning teacher. AI is having an effect that I'm not directly involved in, but AI is challenging not just journalism instruction, but every bit of, the educational system. So things are in flux, but I still think basics like being able to engage people to get information, being able to present that information clearly and concisely are skills that I hope never go out of style.
Yeah, you would hope not. Okay, so what have you been up to since retirement? You mentioned
Yeah,
and obviously to me offline, of course, you mentioned that you've
yeah,
been writing some books and doing some other
yeah,
stuff, but what I guess what made it where was the decision point that you're like, you know what, I'm gonna stop
yeah,
doing this? And
yeah,
then also the kind of the crux of the question that I really want to
yeah,
get to is I think people often, if they've got one purpose and they leave that
yeah,
purpose, finding a new purpose can be quite difficult.
yeah,
And I think that applies to everyone, not
yeah,
just those who have retired, but people who've maybe
yeah,
left a job or moved or they've graduated from
yeah.
school or they need to find something else to do. So,
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm a success story in that sense because I have known people who retired and then felt adrift and never really could put together a post-work life. And I've been lucky. I retired when I was 60 years old, and I did it for really a couple of different reasons. One is if old people don't retire, young people don't have jobs. And there's a lot of people in academia hoping to secure full-time jobs. And when old guys hold on forever, it makes that hard. And I saw that happening and I didn't want to do it. The other thing is, I took teaching very seriously. I loved it. I think I was good in the classroom. I won teaching awards. I put a lot of effort into it. And I knew that the sometimes the last person who realizes he's slipping is the teacher himself. And I didn't want to be one of those old guys still lecturing after students got bored with them. And so I got out when I still felt like I was, at the top of my game. The other reason is there were a lot of other things I wanted to do. So a lot of my work since retirement has been as I pointed out, in the area of the ecological crises, questions around sustainable agriculture. I met and started partnering with a man named Wes Jackson, who is one of the really important figures in the sustainable agriculture movement. So I had a chance to work with a guy who had been a real, touchstone for me. I'd been reading his work for 30 years before I ever met him, and it was just a great opportunity. I also moved to a rural area and I spent a lot of time outdoors, maintaining a property, working on the irrigation system that I mentioned, taking care of the orchard. And I think that's helped ground me. And that's also given me a chance to do other things. So a lot of time now is spent in a prison editing program. I work with 3 or 4 different prisoners in Washington State, and I help them develop stories and edit them and place them in the media. Uh, and because I'm retired and have a pension, I can do that without having to charge anybody. So I've done a lot of different things, none of which I would have predicted, 20 years ago, all of which emerged. And when people, friends of mine say, well, I'm a little nervous about retiring, what am I going to do? My response is, if you're open to what the world offers, you'll find something to do. If you had told me 20 years ago, listen, you're going to be cleaning irrigation ditches in northern New Mexico, I would have said, huh? What's an irrigation ditch? If you had said you're going to be working with prisoners, I would have said, I never even thought of that. If you had said you're going to be co-authoring a book with Wes Jackson, I would have said, yeah, right, in my dreams. Uh, so, I'm well aware I'm lucky. And I don't say this just to be politically correct. I'm white. I'm a guy. I have a PhD. I grew up in the United States at a time when the economy was stable and I had a lot of opportunities. I've had a lot of wind at my back, but I've also tried to be open to change, and I found I got lucky and it's worked out. So when people are afraid of change, I understand why. Uh, and it doesn't always work out, but you roll the dice, you take your chances. There's always something worth doing in the world. And again, if you root yourself in a local community, there is an endless amount of activity, whether it's, volunteering uh, in a in an agency that, the food bank or some there where I live, I can turn around and find 10 different things that are worth my time, right?
Mm,
And so I try to stay open to new opportunities because that's I've been lucky. Those opportunities have come and I've grabbed them and they've worked out. And I like writing, and that's the kind of thing, no matter where you live or how old you are, you can keep doing, even if nobody's reading, or at least not very many people are reading your books, you can still keep writing them.
yeah, fair enough. Um, last two kind of,
Uh-huh.
well, they're not quite quick hitters, but
Sure.
maybe close enough anyways. If you had to give your 16-year-old self a piece of advice, knowing everything you know now, if you could go back in time and talk to 16-year-old you, what would you
Yeah.
tell him?
I would say the world is scarier than you can ever imagine, but don't be so afraid. When I was a kid, I didn't fit the mold. I wasn't a jock. I wasn't super bright. I was terrified of the world. As I said, I was small. I was kind of effeminate. I was a target, and I walked around terrified for too long. And I wish I could go back and say, "Don't be so afraid. You'll make it." The world's full of misfits. I just happen to be a misfit in a certain way. So that doesn't mean the world isn't scary and it's not getting scarier, but that's the world we live in. Go for
Yeah,
it.
yeah, I like it. Last one, um, if you could name or describe maybe as a teacher,
Hmm.
maybe the most rewarding experience or the most rewarding things about the occupation.
Um, I feel like I had an amazing opportunity. Um, I worked at a big university that had great resources, a great library. The students were engaged, and I had a lot of freedom to teach. Uh, by the end of my career, I was making up my own classes in a special program. I mean, I look back and it was just an amazing opportunity. And I think what I learned the longer I taught was to not be afraid of exposing my own thought process to students. What I mean by that is when you're a young teacher, you want to be smart. You want to know the answer to everything. And the older you get, if you're lucky, the more you realize, oh, it's not so simple. And so as I kept teaching, I kept, in a sense, opening up my own thought process in the classroom and saying, listen, here's an interesting question. Here's what I think today. Here's how I got there. Here's what I read. Uh, and I would try to be more transparent. Uh, and I found that students, they're struggling to understand the world. And when they know the professor isn't some, font of wisdom, that the professor is struggling to understand it too, then they can say, wow, if he did that, I can do that. And that became those kind of connections with students where you make yourself kind of intellectually vulnerable and they respond in kind. Those were glorious moments. I can't think of anything I could have done in the world to make money that would have been more rewarding than that. And
Yeah.
there are only two things I miss about teaching. One is those moments with students, and the second is that library. Man, the University of Texas had a great library, and I miss it.
Uh, yeah, that's kind of one of the mantras why I started doing the podcast, which
Yeah,
is like everyone
yeah,
knows something that you don't know.
yeah,
And so the more people you talk to, the more that you learn.
yeah.
Actually, and so I'll follow up with that with one other one. What's
Okay.
something that you learned from a student that maybe like shocked you or that is memorable? Or it doesn't have to be shocking, but something that like stands out to you now.
Yeah, I think what I would put it in a general category. I didn't grow up in a religious household, uh, but Texas has a lot of students who are very religious, and not just Christian, but we had an international student body, and so I had Muslim students and Hindu students. And I think one of the things that I learned most was about the experience of growing up in a religious context, because I just didn't have that myself. And it was endlessly fascinating to hear people's accounts, students' accounts of what church was like or what temple was like or whatever. And I learned a lot, not about the doctrine of religions. You can read that in any book you want to read, not about the history. You can read that, but about the experience. And that was really interesting to me, and I'm very glad I had that. It kind of expanded my awareness of the depth of religious traditions and religious faith.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. Um, Tell the people where, if they want to go look at, like, get any of your books or look at
Yeah.
what it is that you got going
Right.
on, where should they go?
The easiest thing is to just Google my name. If you spell my last name right, Jensen is Jensen. My web page will be the first one that comes up. If you use another search engine, it might get you a Dutch talk show host. I don't have a talk show in Holland, so I'm the other Robert Jensen. But it's actually easy to find me online. I have an archive of every article I've ever written. Some of my books are available for free online. And there's also an email address at the bottom, and I always enjoy hearing from people, not just people who agree with me, but people who think I'm a stark, raving lunatic. I always find those, and I'm not kidding, I find those very uh, engaging, and often I learn more about myself from that than from having people tell me they agree with me.
Very nice. Any last
If
nickels before we get you out of here?
No, no, I save. I'm retired. I have to save all my nickels for for the gas station. So no, we'll leave it at that. Thanks. It's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed this. Really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
yeah, I did as well. For
Good.
those listening, thank you for tuning in. Links will be in the description as always, and we will see you guys next time. Peace. Thanks for tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you want to watch another episode like this one, click there. If you want to subscribe, click there.